Colorado Territory, 1868. The jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains cut into the sky like nature's fortress, standing sentinel over the frontier town of Silverdale. In this unforgiving land where men measured their worth in acres claimed and battles won, Owen Irving believed the wilderness had taught him the only truth worth knowing: a man survives alone or not at all. At 25, Owen had the weathered eyes of someone who'd seen too much for his years, though his face remained youthful beneath his wide-brimmed hat. The sun had bronzed his skin during long days in the saddle, and his lean, muscular frame spoke of a life of physical labor. He kept his face clean-shaven most days, not out of vanity but practicality, fewer places for trail dust to settle. The small ranch he'd built 10 miles outside of town represented everything he believed in: self-reliance, hard work, and solitude. After losing his family to a raid 5 years prior, he'd convinced himself that attachment was a luxury the frontier wouldn't allow. Better to need no one than to risk that pain again. Irving, Marshall Thompson called as Owen secured his chestnut mare to the hitching post outside the general store. "Got yourself a fine day for supplies." Owen nodded, adjusting his hat against the bright June sun. "Figured I'd stock up before the summer rush hits town." The truth was simpler. His ranch, 50 acres with a small herd of cattle and the cabin he'd built with his own hands, had become too quiet even for a man who claimed to prefer silence. Sometimes the isolation of the mountains pressed in on him until he'd saddle up just to hear another human voice, though he'd never admit as much. Inside the store, he handed his list to Mr. Perkins, the shopkeeper, and waited while the old man gathered flour, coffee, and ammunition, the necessities of frontier life. The bell above the door chimed, and Owen turned reflexively. A young woman stepped through, momentarily silhouetted by the bright light outside before the door closed behind her. At 20 years old, Abigail Montgomery carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd known both privilege and loss. Her chestnut brown hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and her blue calico dress, though clearly well-made, showed signs of travel and wear. What caught Owen's attention, however, were her eyes, clear and determined, taking in the store with careful assessment rather than the wide-eyed wonder of most newcomers. "Miss Montgomery," Perkins called with unusual warmth, "your father's supplies are nearly ready." "Thank you, Mr. Perkins." Her voice carried the refined accent of the East, but there was steel beneath the gentility. "Father asked me to add these items." She passed over a slip of paper. Owen found himself watching her longer than was proper, something about her self-possessed manner striking him as unusual for a woman so young in such rugged country. When she turned and caught his gaze, he quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. "You must be one of our neighbors," she said, approaching with surprising directness. "I'm Abigail Montgomery. My father purchased the old Thornton place last month." The Thornton place. Old man Thornton had died last winter, his land sitting vacant through the spring. Owen had considered purchasing it himself to expand his grazing area. Instead, it seemed he had new neighbors, Easterners, by the look and sound of them. "Owen Irving," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "Ranch borders yours to the north." "The one with the red barn and the crooked fence along the ridge?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her expression. "The fence follows the property line," he said defensively. "Land doesn't always cooperate with straight lines out here." "Of course," she smiled, not unkindly. "Father hopes to invite all neighboring ranchers for dinner once we're properly settled." "We believe in building community, Mr. Irving." Community, the word itself made Owen uncomfortable. In his experience, communities were just collections of people who would eventually disappoint or abandon you, or worse, be taken from you when you least expected it. "Not much for social gatherings," he said, collecting his supplies from the counter, "but I appreciate the thought, Miss Montgomery." As he paid for his goods and prepared to leave, she called after him, "The invitation remains open, Mr. Irving. Even the mountains need each other to form a range." Her words followed him out into the sunlight, unwelcome as they were insightful. He secured his supplies and mounted his horse, eager to return to the solitude of his ranch where the only voices were the wind through the pines and the occasional call of a hawk. 3 days later, a distant column of smoke rising from the direction of the Montgomery place drew Owen's attention as he mended fences on his north pasture. He watched it grow for several minutes, debating with himself. It wasn't his concern. New settlers often cleared land, though the smoke seemed too thick for a controlled burn. Cursing under his breath, he mounted his horse and rode toward the property line. He told himself it was simply to ensure the fire wouldn't spread to his land, but the knot of concern in his stomach suggested otherwise. As he crested the ridge separating their properties, he saw the source of the smoke, not a land-clearing fire but the Montgomery's barn, flames licking at the wooden structure while several figures scrambled around it. Two men worked a pump while an older man, presumably Mr. Montgomery, led frightened horses from the stable area. Without hesitation, Owen spurred his horse forward, galloping down the slope. He reached the yard just as Abigail emerged from the barn, leading a panicked mare, her face streaked with soot. "The roof's about to go," he shouted, dismounting in a fluid motion. "Get back." "There's a foal still inside," she called back, passing the mare to one of the workers before turning back toward the building. Owen caught her arm. "I'll get it. Where?" "Last stall on the right," she said, eyes meeting his with desperation. "Please, he's trapped." Nodding once, Owen pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth and ran into the smoke-filled barn. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, the roof beams groaning ominously above. He navigated through the hazy interior until he found the stall she'd indicated. Inside, a young foal huddled in the corner, eyes wild with fear. "Easy now," he murmured, approaching slowly despite the urgency. He removed his bandana and looped it gently around the foal's neck, then scooped the trembling animal into his arms. It was heavier than he expected, but the adrenaline coursing through him provided the necessary strength. The journey back seemed longer, the smoke thicker. A beam crashed down behind him as he staggered toward the rectangle of light that marked the entrance. Just as he reached the doorway, another beam gave way, catching his shoulder and sending him sprawling forward into the yard, the foal tumbling from his grasp but safely outside. Strong hands pulled him clear as the barn's roof collapsed entirely in a shower of sparks and timber. Owen found himself looking up into Abigail's concerned face as she knelt beside him in the dirt. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands checking him for injuries with surprising efficiency. "I'll live," he managed, sitting up despite the protest from his shoulder. "Your foal's safe." "And we're grateful," said an older man approaching them, tall and distinguished despite his soot-covered clothes. "Edward Montgomery," he extended a hand to help Owen stand. "You must be Irving from the North property, quite an introduction." Owen accepted the help, wincing as he rose, "Just being neighborly." "More than neighborly," Abigail corrected, brushing ash from his shirt with a familiarity that should have made him uncomfortable but somehow didn't. "You risked your life for our livestock." "Anyone would have done the same," Owen deflected, though they all knew that wasn't necessarily true on the frontier, where self-preservation often trumped heroics. "Nevertheless, you're joining us for supper," Edward insisted. "No arguments. We've lost the barn, but the house is undamaged, and my daughter sets a fine table even in difficult circumstances." Owen glanced at Abigail, who was now tending to the rescued foal, speaking to it in soothing tones that carried across the yard. Something about the scene, her gentle competence amid the destruction, made it difficult to refuse. "I should see to my own place," he said half-heartedly. "Your ranch will survive an evening without you," Edward replied with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Besides, that shoulder needs attention. Abigail has quite the touch with injuries. Necessity has made her something of a frontier doctor." Owen recognized the futility of resistance. "Much obliged, then." The Montgomery home was surprisingly well appointed for a frontier dwelling, suggesting they'd brought substantial resources from the east. As Owen sat at their dining table that evening, his shoulder bandaged by Abigail's capable hands, he found himself in the uncomfortable position of actually enjoying company. "What brought you to Colorado territory?" he asked, accepting a second helping of stew from Abigail, their fingers brushing momentarily over the serving spoon. Edward exchanged a glance with his daughter before answering. "A fresh start. My wife passed 2 years ago, and Boston held too many memories." "Father was a professor of literature," Abigail added, a fondness in her voice. He decided if he was going to write about adventure and frontier spirit, he should experience it firsthand. Owen raised an eyebrow. "Literature seems a far cry from ranching." "Indeed," Edward chuckled. "My hands have more blisters than they ever got from turning pages, but there's an honesty to this life that I find compelling." and Abigail has taken to it with surprising aptitude. Father exaggerates, she said modestly, though Owen had seen evidence of her capability firsthand. I simply believe in learning what needs to be learned. Even so, Owen said, ranching isn't easy. Especially for he caught himself before saying a woman, aware of how patronizing it would sound. For newcomers, Abigail finished for him, a knowing glint in her eye. Perhaps that's why neighbors are so important out here. To help each other learn and survive. The pointed comment hung between them, challenging Owen's carefully constructed isolation. Sometimes survival means keeping to yourself, he replied, more defensively than he intended. The frontier isn't forgiving of mistakes or attachments. Edward studied him with the perceptive gaze of an educator. You speak from experience, it seems. Owen stiffened, regretting having revealed even that much. Just observation. Abigail sensed his discomfort and skillfully changed the subject. Mr. Irving, Father tells me you have one of the best herds in the region. We're hoping to build ours gradually. Would you consider offering some advice on breeding stock? The conversation shifted to safer territory, cattle, grazing rotations, water management, and Owen found himself sharing knowledge he'd accumulated over years of trial and error. As the evening progressed, he realized it was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone in months, possibly years. When he finally rose to leave, the night sky ablaze with stars, Abigail walked him to where his horse waited. Thank you again, she said quietly, not just for the rescue but for the company. Father misses intellectual conversation. Owen adjusted his hat. Don't know about intellectual, but I'm glad to have helped with the fire. Will you come again? She asked directly. Perhaps Sunday for dinner, we could continue our discussion about rotating the north pastures. He should say no. Every instinct honed by years of self-imposed solitude urged him to politely decline. Instead, he heard himself say, I could bring some lumber, help with rebuilding your barn. Her smile in the moonlight did something peculiar to his chest, a tightening that wasn't altogether unpleasant. That would be most welcome, Mr. Irving. Owen, he corrected, surprising himself again. If we're to be neighbors helping with barn raising, you might as well use my given name. Owen, she repeated, and somehow his name sounded different in her voice. Then you must call me Abigail. He nodded, suddenly eager to leave before he said anything else unexpected. Sunday, then. As he rode home under the vast canopy of stars, the mountains looming like guardians around him, Owen tried to convince himself that his offer was purely practical. Neighbors helping neighbors was a frontier necessity, nothing more. But the memory of Abigail's smile in the moonlight kept intruding on his thoughts, suggesting complications he wasn't prepared to face. Sunday arrived with unsettling quickness. Owen loaded lumber onto his wagon, telling himself repeatedly that this was simply about being a decent neighbor, about ensuring the Montgomery place was secure enough that their problems wouldn't become his. The barn raising would involve other ranchers too. He wouldn't be singled out for attention. He was wrong. When he arrived, he found only Edward, Abigail, and their two hired hands, Jones and Miller, preparing the site where the barn had stood. Where are the others? He asked after unloading the first boards. Others, Edward looked genuinely confused. The neighbors for the barn raising. Abigail approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Today she wore a simpler dress of brown cotton, practical for work, her hair tied back with a ribbon. We didn't organize a barn raising, Owen. We thought to start with the foundation ourselves before imposing on the community. Owen looked at the charred remains of the previous structure, then at the small group expecting to clear and rebuild it. This is at least a week's work for 5 people. Then it's fortunate you've arrived, Edward said cheerfully. Your experience will be invaluable. And so began Owen's unexpected integration into the Montgomery household. What started as a day's assistance extended through the week as they cleared debris, laid the foundation, and began framing the new structure. Each day, he told himself it would be the last, that he had his own ranch to tend to. Each day he returned. It wasn't just the building that drew him back. It was the conversations over lunch breaks, Abigail bringing food and fresh water to the workers. It was Edward's stories of life back east, so different from anything Owen had experienced. It was the growing realization that he'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something beyond himself. Most unsettling was his awareness of Abigail, her quiet competence, her unexpected humor, the way she approached frontier challenges with determination rather than complaint. Unlike other women he'd encountered in town, who seemed either hardened by frontier life or ill-suited for it, she possessed a balance of strength and gentleness that intrigued him. By the fifth day, as they set the last of the roof beams in place before sundown, Owen found himself lingering after Edward and the hands had gone inside. Abigail remained too, surveying their progress in the fading light. "It's going to be a fine barn," she said. "Better than the original, I think." Owen nodded, driving a final nail with perhaps more force than necessary. Should withstand the winter storms better. The old one had too much Eastern design in it, not enough pitch to the roof for heavy snow. She laughed softly. "Is that your subtle way of saying Easterners don't belong in these mountains?" He looked up, realizing how his words might have sounded. "No, I didn't mean." "I'm teasing you, Owen," she said, her eyes crinkling with amusement. "You're allowed to smile occasionally, you know, it won't crack that stoic facade." Despite himself, he felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Force of habit." "What made you so serious?" she asked, leaning against a post. "You can't be more than 25, yet you carry yourself like a man twice that age." The personal question caught him off guard. 25 is plenty old out here," he deflected. "That's not an answer," she persisted gently. Owen set down his hammer, considering how much to reveal. The sky was turning deep purple above the mountains, the first stars appearing in the east. "I came west with my family when I was 17, he finally said. "Parents, 2 younger sisters, we had a small place north of here." Abigail seemed to sense the weight behind his words. "Had. Raid 3 years in. Arapaho War Party." The words came out flat, emotionless, the way he'd trained himself to speak of it. "I was checking fence lines, came back to find," he stopped, the memory still too vivid despite the passing years. "Owen, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice soft with genuine sorrow. "I shouldn't have pried." "It was 5 years ago," he said, as if time alone should have healed it. "Made me realize that out here, attachment is a liability. People who depend on each other just multiply their vulnerabilities." She was quiet for a long moment, considering his words in a way few others had, not with pity or platitudes, but with thoughtful respect. "And yet," she finally said, "you've spent a week helping us rebuild." The observation hung between them, challenging his stated philosophy. Before he could formulate a response, Edward called from the house. "Abigail, supper's ready, ask Owen to join us." She smiled. "Will you stay? Father's attempting a stew. It's either going to be delicious or inedible, and I'd welcome the moral support either way." Owen knew he should refuse, should return to his own solitary cabin and the independence he claimed to value. Instead, he found himself nodding. "I could eat." The meal proved surprisingly good. Edward had apparently retained some culinary skills from his Eastern life. As they ate, Owen noticed how the Montgomerys had already transformed their home, bringing elements of civilization that most frontier dwellings lacked. Books lined improvised shelves, a small piano stood in the corner. The tablecloth and dishes weren't frontier tin but proper ceramics that must have been carefully transported from the East. "You've gone to great lengths to bring comforts with you," he observed as Abigail served coffee after the meal. "Home is what you make it," Edward replied. "The frontier needn't be devoid of civilization's pleasures." "Abigail, play something for us," he continued, gesturing toward the piano. "Show Owen that culture can thrive even in the shadow of these magnificent mountains." She hesitated, glancing at Owen. "I'm sure Mr. Irving isn't interested in piano recitals." "I wouldn't know," Owen admitted. "Never heard one." This seemed to decide her. She moved to the instrument and opened the lid, running her fingers lightly over the keys before beginning to play. The melody that filled the cabin was unlike anything Owen had experienced, not the rough fiddle tunes from saloons in town, but something complex and emotional that seemed to speak directly to something long buried within him. He watched her hands move across the keys with the same confidence she showed in every task, her face transformed by concentration and feeling. When she finished, the final notes seemed to linger in the air like a question. "Chopin," Edward said into the silence, her mother's favorite. Owen realized he'd been holding his breath. "It's beautiful," he said inadequately. Abigail's smile held a hint of shyness that he hadn't seen before. "Thank you. It's difficult to keep in practice out here, but music helps me feel connected to what we left behind." "Do you miss it?" Owen asked. "Boston, I mean." She considered the question seriously. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the concerts, friends, but there's something honest about this place." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the mountains were silhouetted against the night sky. "As if the land strips away pretense and shows you who you really are." Her words resonated uncomfortably with Owen's own experience. The frontier had indeed shown him who he was, or at least who he'd become after loss. A man determined never to need anyone again. Yet here he sat in a stranger's home, sharing meals and music, rebuilding their barn, feeling something stir within him that he'd thought long dead. It was dangerous, this thawing. Dangerous and unwelcome, he stood abruptly. "I should get back, my stock needs tending early." If they were surprised by his sudden departure, neither showed it. Edward shook his hand warmly. "You've been a godsend this week, Owen. We're in your debt." "Just being neighborly," Owen repeated his earlier refrain, though it felt increasingly inadequate. Abigail walked him to the door. "Will you come tomorrow to finish the barn?" He should say no. Should create distance before this situation became more complicated. "I'll be by after I check my herd," he heard himself say instead. She smiled, the simple expression causing that strange tightening in his chest again. "Good night then, ride safely." As Owen rode home through the darkness, the mountains looming like judgment around him, he wrestled with his conflicting impulses. The rational part of him recognized the danger in becoming entangled with the Montgomerys, not physical danger, perhaps, but emotional vulnerability he'd sworn to avoid. Yet another part, long suppressed but growing stronger, craved the connection they offered. The barn was completed over the next 3 days, a sturdy structure that Owen knew would withstand the harsh mountain winters better than its predecessor. With the project finished, he had no legitimate reason to continue visiting the Montgomery place, a fact that bothered him more than it should have. He forced himself to stay away for a week, focusing on his own ranch and the approaching autumn preparations. But thoughts of Abigail intruded constantly, her smile, her competence, the way she'd looked playing the piano in the lamplight. He found himself watching the neighboring property from his north pasture, noting the smoke from their chimney, the occasional movement of figures in the distance. His self-imposed isolation was broken when Jones, one of the Montgomery's hands, rode up to his cabin one afternoon. "Miss Montgomery requests your assistance, Mr. Irving," the man said without dismounting. "One of the new heifers has gone missing. She's organizing a search before nightfall." Owen's first thought was concern for Abigail out searching alone. His second was irritation at himself for caring so much. "I'll come. Give me 5 minutes." When he arrived at the Montgomery place, he found not just Abigail but a small gathering of neighboring ranchers he recognized from town. The Hendersons from the East property, old Sam Wilson who ranched the South Valley, and the Peterson brothers with their distinctive matching beards. "Owen," Abigail called, relief evident in her voice. She wore riding clothes, practical trousers under a split skirt that would have raised eyebrows in town but made perfect sense for rough country work. "Thank you for coming. Father's in town on business, and this heifer represented a significant investment." "When was it last seen?" he asked, all business despite the way his pulse had quickened at her greeting. "This morning during feeding. Miller noticed it missing when he did the midday count. It's young, inexperienced with the range. Probably followed the creek up into the high meadows," Sam Wilson suggested. "Young stock often does." "We should split up," Owen said, taking charge naturally. "Cover more ground before dark. Henderson, you and Wilson take the eastern slopes. Peterson's check the south ravine. Miss Montgomery and I will follow the creek northward." If anyone thought it improper for Abigail to ride out alone with Owen, they kept their opinions to themselves. This was the frontier, after all, where practicality often overrode social conventions. As they rode side by side up the creek bed, Owen stole glances at his companion. She sat her horse with the ease of someone who'd spent significant time in the saddle, despite her Eastern upbringing. "You ride well," he observed. "Boston has riding academies," she replied with a smile. Though they emphasize form over function, I've had to adapt to frontier practicalities. You've adapted to a lot, he said, guiding his horse around a fallen log. Most Easterners who come out here either leave within a year or end up buried on the prairie, she finished wryly. Father and I were aware of the challenges, we didn't come unprepared. Even so, it's a hard life, especially for a woman. This time she sounded genuinely irritated. You were about to say that the other night too. Do you really think women are so much more fragile than men, Owen? He flushed, embarrassed to be caught in outdated thinking. No, that's not what I meant. It's hard for anyone not raised to it. The isolation, the physical demands, the constant vigilance. Her expression softened, like the isolation you've chosen for yourself. The personal observation caught him off guard. Before he could respond, she continued, I've noticed you have no social callers, maintain minimal contact with town. You've built walls that have nothing to do with your property lines. You don't know me well enough to make those judgments, he said stiffly. Perhaps not, she conceded, but I recognize self-imposed solitude when I see it. After Mother died, Father retreated into his books for months. I had to practically drag him back to the world of the living. Owen was saved from responding by movement ahead, a flash of white in the underbrush that might be the heifer's markings. He gestured for silence and they approached slowly. Sure enough, the missing animal was tangled in a thicket, frightened but uninjured. Together they worked to free it, their earlier tension forgotten in the practical demands of the task. By the time they led the heifer back down the creek toward home, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in dramatic oranges and purples. Beautiful, isn't it? Abigail said, pausing to admire the view. Sometimes I think the mountains themselves have souls, ancient and wise, watching over us small, temporary creatures. Owen had never thought of the landscape in such poetic terms, though he'd always felt a connection to the rugged peaks and valleys. They're unforgiving, he said. Beautiful, yes, but they'll kill you if you don't respect them. Like many worthwhile relationships, she replied with unexpected insight. The greatest rewards often come with the greatest risks. He looked at her then, really looked, her profile against the sunset, the certainty in her expression, and felt something shift within him. This woman saw the world differently than anyone he'd known, finding meaning and connection where he'd trained himself to see only danger and isolation. We should get back before dark, he said, unable to address the deeper implications of her words. They returned to find the other searchers already gathered at the Montgomery place, reporting no success in their areas. The discovery of the heifer was met with approval and an invitation from Abigail for everyone to stay for a meal, which she quickly prepared with Miller's help. The evening turned unexpectedly festive, with Sam Wilson producing a harmonica and the Peterson brothers sharing a jug of home-distilled whiskey. Owen found himself drawn into conversation with his neighbors in a way he'd avoided for years, discussing cattle prices, weather predictions, and local politics. Through it all, he was acutely aware of Abigail moving among her guests, ensuring everyone was fed and comfortable. She caught his eye occasionally across the room, her smile warming something long cold within him. When the gathering finally dispersed, Owen lingered, offering to help clean up. That's kind but unnecessary, she said, though she didn't insist he leave. It was good to see you with the others. You're well respected, you know. They value your opinions. Owen shrugged uncomfortably, just practical matters. Community is practical out here, she countered, stacking plates with efficient movements. No one survives the frontier entirely alone, no matter how capable they are. He thought of the years he'd spent minimizing his connections, convinced that self-reliance was the only safe way forward. Some risks aren't worth taking. Abigail set down the dishes and turned to face him directly. You're referring to your family. You believe that loving them made losing them worse. Her directness was startling. Wouldn't it have? Would you trade the years you had with them to avoid the pain of losing them? She asked quietly. The question hit him like a physical blow. Would he erase his sister's laughter, his mother's embrace, his father's steady guidance just to avoid the agony of their loss? That's not the point, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Isn't it? Her gaze held his, unwavering. You've built your entire philosophy on the idea that connections are dangerous. I'm simply asking if the alternative, complete isolation, is actually better. Owen felt cornered, not by her presence but by the uncomfortable truth in her words. "I should go," he said, retreating to safer ground. "Thank you for the evening." She didn't try to stop him, but her parting words followed him into the night. "The offer of friendship remains open, Owen, when you're ready." Friendship. Was that what he was avoiding, or something more complicated, more frightening in its implications? The next 2 weeks brought an early autumn storm, keeping everyone confined to their own properties as rain turned the mountain paths to treacherous mud. Owen told himself the isolation was welcome, a return to the simplicity he preferred, but the cabin seemed emptier than before, the silence heavier. When the weather finally cleared, he found himself riding toward town, telling himself he needed supplies when in truth, his pantry was well stocked. The real reason became clear when he encountered Edward Montgomery outside the general store. "Owen, good to see you," the older man greeted him warmly. "We were beginning to wonder if the storm had washed you away." "Takes more than rain to cause problems," Owen replied, dismounting. "How did your place fare?" "Admirably, thanks in no small part to that excellent barn you helped build, though I'm afraid Abigail has been confined to bed these past 3 days, caught a chill helping secure the livestock before the worst hit." Concern flared immediately. "Is it serious?" Edward's expression softened knowingly. "Not dangerously so, but she's quite miserable. Dr. Simmons provided some powders, but what she really needs is rest and perhaps some company besides her old father. She's been asking about you, in fact." Owen tried to ignore the leap his heart gave at this information. "Just being neighborly, I expect." "Is that what we're calling it?" Edward asked with gentle amusement. "Owen, I may be older, but I'm neither blind nor foolish. My daughter has developed a certain regard for you, and unless I'm very much mistaken, it's not entirely one-sided." Owen stiffened. "Mr. Montgomery." "Edward, please, and before you protest, know that I'm not presuming anything improper. I'm simply observing that two people who clearly enjoy each other's company might benefit from acknowledging that fact." "It's more complicated than that," Owen said, uncomfortable with the direct approach that seemed to run in the Montgomery family. "Because of your family?" Edward asked softly. "Abigail mentioned some of your history, a terrible tragedy, truly. But Owen, do you really believe they would want you to live the rest of your life alone because of what happened to them?" The question was too similar to Abigail's from weeks before, striking at the foundation of the life Owen had built for himself. "I should get my supplies," he said, unwilling to continue the conversation. Edward nodded, respecting his reticence. "Of course, but consider riding out our way when you're done. Abigail could use some new reading material from the lending library, and I'm afraid I need to meet with the sawmill owner this afternoon. It would ease my mind knowing someone looked in on her." It was a transparent attempt to draw Owen back to their home, but he found he didn't mind. "I'll bring the books," he agreed. 2 hours later, he approached the Montgomery house with a satchel of novels selected by the librarian as suitable for a young lady of refinement. His knock was answered by Miller, who directed him inside with a knowing smile that suggested the entire household was aware of Edward's matchmaking efforts. He found Abigail in the small parlor, reclining on a settee with a quilt drawn over her lap despite the fire blazing in the hearth. Her complexion was paler than usual, with a feverish brightness to her eyes that concerned him, but her smile at his entrance was genuine. "Owen, what a pleasant surprise." "Your father mentioned you were unwell," he said, suddenly aware that he was alone with her in a way that might raise eyebrows in more settled areas. "He asked me to bring these from the library." He held up the satchel of books. "How thoughtful," she said, gesturing for him to sit, "though I suspect father's motives weren't entirely literary. He's been trying to lure you back since the storm cleared." Owen took the offered seat, oddly comfortable with her directness. He wasn't subtle about it. She laughed, the sound turning into a cough that she muffled with a handkerchief. "Subtlety isn't his strong suit. I apologize if he made you uncomfortable." "I came, didn't I?" The words came out more revealing than he'd intended, and he quickly changed the subject. "How bad is the chill?" "Worse yesterday, better today. Dr. Simmons assures me I'll live, though his foul-tasting powders might be the death of me yet." She gestured to a small envelope on the side table with evident distaste. "You should be more careful," he said, the words coming out more sternly than intended. Frontier ailments can turn serious quickly. Is that concern I detect, Mr. Irving? She teased, though her eyes were serious. I thought attachment was a liability out here. He flushed, caught in his own contradiction. Being practical isn't the same as being uncaring. No, she agreed softly, it isn't. Which makes me wonder if perhaps you've been using practicality as a shield against deeper feelings. The conversation was venturing into dangerous territory again. Owen reached for the safer topic of the books, explaining the librarian's selections and watching as Abigail examined each with genuine interest. They spent the next hour discussing literature. Her education had been far more extensive than his, but he surprised her with his knowledge of certain authors he'd discovered in his own limited reading. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by her occasional cough, but otherwise reminiscent of the comfortable exchanges they'd shared during the barn building. When Miller brought tea, Owen realized how long he'd stayed. I should let you rest, he said, rising reluctantly. Must you go? She asked, and the simple question contained layers of meaning he wasn't ready to explore. My stock needs tending before nightfall, he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. She nodded, accepting his retreat. Thank you for the books and the company. It means more than you might realize, especially out here where visitors are rare treasures. As he rode home, Owen found himself more unsettled than ever. The comfortable isolation he'd cultivated for years now felt like a prison of his own making. Abigail's presence in his life, her directness, her unexpected strength combined with genuine warmth, had awakened possibilities he'd refused to consider since burying his family. The next morning brought clear skies and a decision. Owen completed his chores early, then saddled his horse and rode not toward the Montgomery place but up into the high meadow where he'd buried his parents and sisters. The simple wooden crosses he'd erected still stood, weathered but intact, marking the family plot he'd established on the most beautiful corner of his property. He hadn't visited in months, finding the grief too raw despite the passing years. Now he stood before the graves, hat in hand, struggling to articulate the thoughts that had brought him there. I've met someone, he finally said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to speak the words. A woman, she's different. Makes me question things I thought I knew for certain. He paused, the mountain breeze ruffling his hair. I've been keeping people at a distance because I couldn't bear to lose anyone else the way I lost you, but lately I've been wondering if that's really what you would have wanted for me. No answer came but the distant cry of a hawk and the rustle of pine needles. Yet somehow the act of speaking his thoughts aloud clarified something within him. His family had lived fully, embraced connections, built community even on the dangerous frontier. Their lives had been cut tragically short, but they'd been lives filled with meaning and love. Was he honoring their memory by existing in isolation, or was he merely surrendering to fear? The question followed him back down the mountain and through the next days as he found himself increasingly drawn to the Montgomery place. No longer needing pretexts, he began joining them for Sunday dinners, helping Edward with ranch improvements, and spending quiet evenings listening to Abigail play the piano or discussing books they'd both read. Edward observed this growing connection with obvious approval but tactfully avoided direct comments, allowing the relationship to develop at its own pace. As autumn deepened toward winter, rumors reached Silverdale of increased tensions with certain Native American bands north of the territory. Though the major conflicts had ended years before, isolated incidents still occurred, especially in remote areas. Owen found himself growing concerned for the Montgomerys' safety, their ranch being somewhat isolated from other settlements. One evening after dinner he broached the subject with Edward while Abigail was occupied with household tasks. I've been thinking, Owen said carefully, with winter approaching and these rumors of unrest, it might be prudent to establish some contingency plans. Signals between our properties, perhaps, or regular check-ins. Edward regarded him thoughtfully, a reasonable precaution. Though I suspect your concern has a specific focus. His gaze drifted meaningfully toward the kitchen where Abigail could be heard directing Miller in storing preserved foods. Owen didn't deny it. Your daughter has become important to me. I'm aware, Edward said, his expression warming, and I believe the feeling is mutual. She's never said so directly. Abigail has her pride, but I know my daughter. She lights up when you arrive in a way I haven't seen since her mother was alive. The comparison to Abigail's mother caught Owen off guard. I haven't spoken to her about my feelings. It's complicated. Love generally is, Edward replied simply, but complications don't diminish its value, quite the opposite in my experience. Love, the word hung between them, both acknowledgement and challenge. Owen hadn't allowed himself to use it, even in his private thoughts, but hearing it spoken aloud resonated with truth he couldn't deny. Before he could respond, Abigail returned to the room, sensing the serious atmosphere. Have I interrupted something important? Just men's talk, Edward said, rising with a meaningful glance at Owen. I just remembered some correspondence I need to complete before the post rider comes tomorrow. If you'll excuse me. His departure left Owen and Abigail alone in the parlor, the fire crackling in comfortable counterpoint to the silence between them. She took the seat her father had vacated, studying Owen's expression. You seem troubled, she observed. Is it the rumors from the north? Her perception startled him. Partly, how did you know about those? Contrary to what some might believe, women do listen when men discuss important matters, she said with gentle irony. I heard Mr. Peterson talking in town last week. Does it worry you? He asked. She considered the question seriously. I'd be foolish not to be concerned, but I refuse to live in fear. We've taken reasonable precautions. Father has ensured both Miller and Jones are well armed, and we maintain regular contact with neighbors. Her expression softened. Including you, though your visits seem motivated by more than security concerns these days. The opening was clear. Owen could acknowledge the growing connection between them or retreat once more behind practicality. Looking at her in the firelight, her expression open and expectant, he found he no longer wanted to hide. My visits have nothing to do with being neighborly anymore, he admitted. Surely you know that. I've hoped, she said softly, but you're not an easy man to read, Owen Irving. You keep your feelings carefully guarded. With good reason, he stood, suddenly needing movement to accompany the rush of emotion. Abigail, my feelings for you have become complicated, more than I intended. More than might be wise. She rose too, closing the distance between them with quiet determination, because you're still afraid of loss, of caring too deeply and being hurt again. Yes, he acknowledged, the simple truth freeing after so much evasion. But also because I'm not sure I'm what you deserve. You could have stayed in Boston, married a professor or businessman, lived a comfortable life surrounded by culture and society. Is that what you think I want? She asked, genuine surprise in her voice. Owen, I came west by choice. I love this land, its wildness, its honesty, its challenge, and I've come to care deeply for a man who embodies all those qualities. She reached for his hand, her touch sending warmth through him despite its lightness. I don't want some comfortable Eastern life. I want this one, mountains and all. The declaration left him momentarily speechless. In the silence, she continued, but what matters is what you want. If you truly believe isolation is safer than connection, then. He didn't let her finish. Acting on impulse that had been building for months, he closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, but deepening as she responded with unmistakable warmth. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Owen found words he'd thought forever buried rising to his lips. I love you, he said simply. I've been fighting it because love feels dangerous. But not loving you has become the greater risk. Her smile was radiant, her eyes bright with emotion. Then we'll face the dangers together, all of them, winter storms, frontier threats, and yes, even the risk of heartbreak. Together, he agreed, the word itself a promise he'd never expected to make again. The winter of 1868-69 proved one of the harshest in territorial memory, with storms that isolated homesteads for weeks at a time and temperatures that tested even the most seasoned frontiersmen. Yet for Owen, it was a season of unexpected warmth and connection. With Edward's blessing, he and Abigail began a proper courtship, though frontier practicalities meant this looked different than it might have in Boston society. Owen spent increasing time at the Montgomery ranch, helping prepare for winter and eventually moving into their bunkhouse when travel between properties became too dangerous in the deep snow. The arrangement raised some eyebrows in town, but Edward's respected position and Owen's reputation for integrity largely silenced potential gossip. Besides, survival took precedence over social niceties in the harsh mountain winter. Christmas was celebrated with an intimacy Owen hadn't experienced since losing his family, a small tree cut from the property, decorated with handmade ornaments Abigail had crafted, and a feast that somehow incorporated both frontier staples and Eastern traditions. Owen presented Abigail with a carved wooden music box he'd spent weeks creating in secret, while she gave him a leather-bound journal with his initials tooled into the cover. "For recording our adventures," she explained as he ran his fingers over the fine workmanship, "and perhaps someday for sharing them with our children." The casual reference to a shared future, to family, would once have sent Owen retreating behind his walls of self-protection. Now it filled him with quiet hope, a sensation so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. As winter slowly yielded to spring, the couple's plans solidified. They would marry in May, when the mountain passes were clear enough for the circuit preacher to reach Silverdale. Rather than choosing between their properties, they would combine operations, with Owen's superior cattle herd and Abigail's more developed homestead creating a stronger ranch than either had separately. Edward, showing unexpected adaptability for a former academic, took to ranching with increasing competence, though he admitted privately to Owen that he looked forward to eventually passing more responsibility to the younger couple while he pursued the book about frontier life he'd been planning since their arrival. The wedding plans were proceeding smoothly when the threat that had been merely rumors in the fall materialized with shocking suddenness. A small band of renegade Ute warriors, displaced and desperate after broken treaties and harsh winters, began raiding isolated homesteads north of Silverdale. 2 ranches were burned, their occupants killed or taken captive, before a rider brought warning to town. The territorial militia was days away, leaving the settlers to organize their own defense. Owen was in town when the news arrived, purchasing supplies for spring planting. His first thought was of Abigail and Edward, alone at their ranch with only Miller and Jones for protection. Without waiting for the hastily organized town meeting to conclude, he mounted his horse and rode hard for the Montgomery place, pushing his animal to its limits over the muddy spring trails. He arrived to find Edward calmly but efficiently organizing defenses, having already received word from another neighbor. Abigail was helping Jones board up vulnerable windows, her face set in determined lines that somehow made Owen love her even more. "Owen," she set down her hammer when she saw him, relief evident in her expression. "We heard the news an hour ago." "I came as soon as word reached town," he said, dismounting quickly. "The militia's been summoned, but they're at least 3 days out. The town's organizing a defense patrol." Edward approached, rifle in hand. "Jones spotted smoke to the north this morning, McDermott's place most likely. They're working their way south." Owen nodded grimly. "McDermott's is less than 15 miles from here. We should prepare for the possibility of attack, but I think evacuation would be wiser. The town's setting up a defensive perimeter. All outlying homesteads are being encouraged to shelter there until the militia arrives." "And leave everything we've built?" Abigail questioned, though without panic. "Our livestock are home." "Property can be rebuilt," Owen said firmly. "Lives cannot." The memory of returning to find his own family's homestead destroyed flashed unbidden in his mind. The smoke, the silence, the devastating evidence of lives cut brutally short. He couldn't risk losing Abigail the same way. "Owen is right," Edward said, surprisingly practical for a former academic. "We'll take what we can carry, drive the most valuable stock toward town, and leave at first light tomorrow." The decision made, they worked through the day and into the evening, preparing essentials for transport and securing what had to be left behind as best they could. Owen insisted on staying the night, unwilling to leave even temporarily with potential danger so close. After a tense supper, Edward retired early, leaving Owen and Abigail alone by the fire. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, an intimate atmosphere developed between them, heightened by the awareness of threats beyond their control. "I was afraid," Abigail admitted quietly, "when I first heard the news. Not of what might happen exactly, but that history might be repeating itself for you, that you might lose someone else you care about to violence." Owen took her hand, marveling again at how naturally their fingers intertwined. "That fear crossed my mind," he acknowledged. "It's why I rode so hard to reach you." And if the worst had happened, if you'd found what you found before, the question was direct, unflinching in its recognition of possibilities. I don't know, he answered honestly. 5 years ago, losing my family nearly destroyed me. Losing you, he paused, searching for words equal to the emotion. It would break something in me that I'm not sure could be mended. Yet you're here, she observed. You didn't run from the possibility, didn't try to protect yourself by keeping distance. That's the difference, Owen. You've chosen connection despite the risk. He drew her closer, the weight of her against him both comfort and reminder of vulnerability. Because a life without you in it, even a safe one, doesn't seem worth living anymore. In the quiet that followed, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the distant sounds of night, they held each other with the tender urgency of those who understand how precious and precarious love can be on the frontier. Morning brought an unexpected complication. As they prepared to depart, Miller, who'd been checking the livestock one last time, rode in with alarming news. Riders approaching from the north, he reported breathlessly. 6, maybe 7. Moving fast. Owen's decision was immediate. No time to reach town, we make our stand here. He turned to Edward. The root cellar, it's reinforced for winter storage. Edward nodded, understanding instantly. Abigail, gather whatever weapons and ammunition we have. You'll take shelter therewith. I will not, she interrupted with calm certainty. I can shoot as well as Jones and better than you, father. 4 rifles have better odds than 3. Abigail, Owen began, his protective instincts flaring. Would you ask Miller or Jones to hide while others defended their home? She challenged. Then don't ask it of me. This is my home too, and I will fight for it. The logic was irrefutable, though it cut against every impulse. Owen had to keep her safe. There was no time to argue regardless, the distant sound of hoofbeats already carried on the morning air. Positions, Owen ordered, assuming command naturally. Jones, the barn loft gives the best view of the northern approach. Miller, the west corner of the house. Edward, east corner. Abigail and I will take the main house. They moved quickly, Owen leading Abigail to the front room, where 2 windows provided clear views of the approaching trail, while offering solid log walls for protection. As they checked and loaded rifles, Owen caught her hand briefly. Stay low, aim carefully, and remember, if they break through, the cellar is the fallback position. Promise me you'll retreat there if necessary. Her eyes met his, steady despite the danger. I promise, but Owen, we will defend this home together. The riders appeared at the edge of the cleared land surrounding the ranch, silhouettes against the morning light. Through his rifle sight, Owen could make out that they were indeed Native Americans, though their exact tribal affiliation wasn't immediately clear. Hold fire until they make hostile intent clear, he murmured to Abigail. Sometimes these are just scouting parties, not raiding ones. The distinction proved irrelevant moments later when one of the riders raised a rifle and fired toward the barn, the shot going wide but the intent unmistakable. Fire at will, Owen called loudly enough for the others to hear, then squeezed his own trigger. His shot caught the lead rider in the shoulder, sending the man tumbling from his horse. The remaining warriors scattered, seeking cover at the edge of the property. What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire that seemed to stretch for hours, though it likely lasted less than 30 minutes. The attackers were persistent but cautious, clearly not expecting the organized resistance they encountered. Owen and Abigail worked in coordinated silence, covering different angles, reloading for each other, communicating with gestures and brief words. 2 more attackers fell to their combined fire before the remaining warriors regrouped for what appeared to be a concentrated charge on the main house. Owen braced for the assault, aware that close-quarters fighting would dramatically reduce their defensive advantage. The charge never came. Instead, the sound of multiple hoofbeats approaching from the south drew everyone's attention. A group of riders from town, led by Sam Wilson and the Peterson brothers, galloped into view, rifles raised and ready. Outflanked and outnumbered, the remaining attackers retreated rapidly, disappearing into the northern woods from which they'd emerged. The danger passed with surprising suddenness, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the approaching rescuers' calls and the moans of the wounded attackers. Are you hurt? Owen asked Abigail, scanning her for injuries with frantic attention. No, she assured him, her face smudged with gunpowder but her eyes clear. You. He shook his head, relief making him momentarily dizzy. You fought well. Better than well. We defended our home, she said simply, together as promised. Outside, they found Edward and the hands unharmed as well, already greeting the town party with grateful handshakes. Sam Wilson approached Owen with grudging respect. Figured you might need help out here, the old rancher said. Saw the smoke from McDermott's place and gathered who I could. Your timing was impeccable, Owen acknowledged. Thank you. As the immediate crisis subsided, decisions needed to be made about the wounded attackers and the safety of remaining on the property. The militia was still days away, and the possibility of a larger raiding party couldn't be discounted. We should return to town, Wilson advised. Safety in numbers until this business is settled. Edward looked to Owen and Abigail, deferring to them in a subtle acknowledgement of the partnership that had formed. What do you think? Owen considered the tactical situation, weighing the risks of staying against the psychological victory of abandoning their home. Before he could speak, Abigail answered with quiet conviction, "This is our home. We've defended it once, we can do so again if necessary, but I won't be driven away by fear." Her words echoed Owen's own thoughts so precisely that he felt a surge of pride mixed with something deeper, the recognition that they truly were partners in every sense. "We stay," he agreed, "but we'll accept any men Wilson can spare to strengthen our defenses, at least until we're certain the danger has passed." The decision proved sound. The wounded attackers, treated with basic humanity despite their actions, revealed through a translator that their small band had already been reduced by half. The larger Ute groups had moved westward weeks earlier, leaving only this desperate splinter to cause trouble. When the territorial militia finally arrived 3 days later, they found a well-defended homestead rather than abandoned ruins, with wounded prisoners humanely contained and prepared for proper legal proceedings rather than frontier justice. The incident, traumatic as it was, served to bond the community more tightly. Neighbors who had kept mostly to themselves, Owen included, recognized the value of connection and mutual support. The Montgomery Ranch became something of a gathering point in the following weeks, with ranchers stopping by to help repair minor damage from the attack and share information about herd movements and security arrangements. For Owen and Abigail, the experience crystallized what they already knew, that their partnership was built on mutual respect, shared courage, and a deep understanding of each other's strengths. The wedding planned for May seemed unnecessarily distant after facing death together, and by mutual agreement, they moved the date forward to early April, as soon as the circuit preacher could reach them. The ceremony took place on the front porch of the Montgomery home, with the mountains that had witnessed their meeting and growing love providing a majestic backdrop. Edward gave away his daughter with evident joy, while neighbors from miles around gathered to celebrate not just a wedding, but the community's resilience in the face of frontier challenges. Abigail wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had been her mother's, adapted to frontier practicality but still elegant. Owen, unaccustomed to formal attire, nonetheless cut a striking figure in a new suit ordered specially from Denver, his usual hat replaced for the occasion with neatly combed hair that made him look younger than his 26 years. Their vows, spoken clearly for all to witness, incorporated both traditional promises and personal additions that acknowledged their unique journey. Owen, who once believed that the frontier allowed no place for love, pledged not just fidelity and protection but partnership and openness. Abigail, who had crossed a continent seeking a meaningful life, promised strength in adversity and joy in prosperity, committing to build something lasting in the shadow of the mountains they both loved. The celebration afterward continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to satisfy even the hardiest appetites. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, creating pools of golden light where couples danced to Sam Wilson's surprisingly melodious fiddle. Owen led Abigail in a dance, their movements more natural than he would have expected for someone who'd avoided such gatherings for years. As they moved together beneath the stars, with the silhouette of mountains etched against the darkening sky, he marveled at the journey that had brought him from isolated survivor to connected husband. "Happy?" he asked softly, though her radiant expression had already answered the question. "Completely," she confirmed, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Though I keep thinking about what you told me that first night we really talked, that attachment is a liability on the frontier." "I was wrong," he admitted easily, the truth of it settled deep in his bones. Connection isn't weakness, it's strength. You taught me that. We taught each other, she corrected gently. And we'll keep learning together, building something beautiful in the shadow of these mountains. As the celebration continued around them, Owen drew his bride closer, no longer afraid of what loving her might cost but profoundly grateful for what it had already given him. A home not just of land and timber, but of heart and spirit, where even the most wounded soul could heal and flourish. In the years that followed, the Irving Montgomery Ranch became one of the most prosperous in the territory. Edward completed his book about frontier life, which found surprising success back east, while Owen and Abigail expanded both their herds and their horizons. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah after Owen's mother, arrived the following spring, followed 2 years later by a son they called James. The mountains remained as challenging as ever, winters harsh, summers sometimes drought-stricken, the rhythms of frontier life demanding constant adaptation and resilience. Yet within the home they built together, warmth and connection flourished, proving that even in the wildest places, love could not only survive but thrive. Owen, who once believed that isolation was the price of survival, discovered instead that true living began only when he opened himself to love's possibilities. Under the watchful gaze of the ancient peaks, he and Abigail created not just a ranch but a legacy of courage, partnership, and the enduring truth that adversity, faced together, often nurtures the most beautiful blooms of all.